tax reform. The reason we bring up tax reform, and I know it's kind of separate from DOT, is the fact that this past year, as Michael alluded to, there was a big fight in the state about raising the gas tax. It ended up being about, like, I think it was a 70% gas tax or so. It was going to raise it from like 13 cents a gallon to maybe 20. And however, as Michael brought up, we have a general fund, which is kind of like this big slush of money that everything you pay goes into it. So if you pay income tax, sales tax, property tax, that all goes into the general fund. And then you can say you're spending gas tax money on the roads, however, that's not exactly, you can't be exactly sure really which dollar you're spending, which is the hard part to really, that's the hard part to argue that tax raise. You don't know if that money's going to be there because it's still got to go through the Senate Budget Committee and be approved by the Senate. So we can raise that tax and still not see that money for our roads is the big deal. So granted, we're not advocating for a tax raise. However, the reason we're advocating for tax reform is because if there is going to be a tax raise, we'd at least like to know where that money is going. So it would allow for earmarking. South Carolina, currently nothing can be earmarked because it's in a general fund and then has to be approved by the Senate. So if we had some tax reform and we were allowed to earmark things, we would actually be able to really be able to tell where our money is being spent. And this audit may have actually been completely different. We may have been able to say, hey, X, Y, and Z is being spent this way 100%, whereas, you know, not that we think they are being intentionally misleading with these metrics they've given us. We think it's very hard to really, it's hard to say with 100% certainty that they are getting this money from here.
Well, I'm glad to see you paid attention to Chapter 5 on the gas tax and Chapter 10 on earmarking.
Yes.
Why would they not want to do it?
I think it gives,
put yourself in the position of a powerful senator or representative. Why would you not want it?
I think they like the certain level of autonomy. So you say, hey, you know, let's chip a little off here and bring it to maybe what I've got, this thing I need done in my district. Let's fight for some money in my district. I need to get reelected. So I think comes with that comes a little bit of like constituency fighting or fighting for your constituents. However, we do agree that there needs to be a certain level of autonomy. So you know, I think in that tax reform could come, you could earmark the gas tax for 5 years or maybe 10 years or something like that. I know this wasn't a tax reform project, however, this is one of our recommendations that we think would have done really well for the state of South Carolina.
Okay.
Next year we've got Michael, who's going to go ahead and talk to you about funding reform.
Yeah, and I'll also add, just in general with these recommendations that we hope to provide, we're not asking to just completely abolish whatever system we already have in place, but significantly, specifically, we're asking for better accountability. You know, as we were saying before, the STIB really has zero accountability to anyone but themselves because of the people that are on the STIB, because of how they select their projects, because they can easily decide, oh, this project is going to influence District 4, so, you know, let's not use the 92 criteria or the 39 criteria, sorry, that we have that we've been using. Let's just approve this because this is going to be good for us and it's going to bring in revenue and it's going to create economic development. And so ultimately, like, that comes straight into this.
Is there anything in the criterion that mandatorily says this project is so bad, like a triage system, that it must be addressed? Some objective criterion rather than, hey, it's in this district, or I want a log roll for my friend over here.
No, well, that's the thing, is that the criterion that they follow, they don't have to explicitly follow. So they follow it because it...
So there's no objective standard is what you're saying?
Yes, say $100 million. It's basically, the project has to be more than $100 million, and then from there on out, it's kind of, they've got the autonomy.
So you'd have to let the roads deteriorate so badly before you can fix it?
Essentially.
Yeah, it doesn't, based on the criterion that they have, and the way that they are so judiciously choosing what projects they support and what projects they fund. And remember, this isn't the SCDOT, this is the STIB, but we see them as connected because there are members on the
Okay,
STIP
so
from the
what about
SCDOT.
SCDOT? Do they have an objective criterion to say, if it's this, if it's a, red level, we must do it, a yellow level, we must, it's next?
So, actually, one of our group members, Adam, he found this. Basically, as we were searching in the really early stages of our project, we were kind of saying that they also had complete autonomy on how they chose
Okay, so there's no objective criteria for either.
Yeah, basically.
That's important to know.
Yeah, basically it was, the check is themselves.
Yeah.
Basically, they.
So that's not a check.
Yeah, that's not a check. So
On their website, when they say how there's a little thing where you can click on it and says how we select our projects.
It's like we
and it
choose
says
it.
we
Yeah.
pick which projects we want to do.
It's not very.
So that comes
It's good to
with
be
that-
king, isn't it?
So that comes with that, yeah, so that comes with that breeding ground approach, and the more we dig, the more we see that these people have.
It's not necessarily that it is corrupt, as you
No, but it
pointed out, but it
Yeah.
lends itself to that
Right.
if you're not careful.
And that's why we're calling for more autonomy, because if you, or not more autonomy, but more accountability, because if you have so much autonomy in the way that the DOT is run, and then you have so much autonomy in the way that you're getting your funding for the projects that you're doing, you can do whatever you want, really. You don't have to like,
No.
you can't, there's no idea, like, there's no limit to what they can do, especially because, as we'll see later on, the secretary who oversees it is appointed by the governor but doesn't really even do anything, and even now the secretary is approved by the commission. So, yeah. But so we think, recommending in terms of funding, we think that funding needs to be spent more wisely, and we need to fund projects that are necessary. Like we said before, earmark taxes, the budget surplus can be used, and those may help us to push towards a scenario where we're funding projects that are necessary.
So earmark taxes, like a gas tax earmark?
Yes.
Okay, and if you do that, is it revenue neutral or something additional or from somewhere else or what?
Yeah, so the way that it would be set up is if we have a gas tax, we say, we're going to direct this towards fixing potholes.
Oh, so you're not trying to add it, you're just trying to say with the 13 cents, it doesn't go into the generator?
Yes,
I
yeah,
got you, got you.
yeah, if we have an earmark tax, we're saying, don't put that in the general fund.
Got you, that makes sense.
We want to be able to know that this is going directly to its intended use. And so, with federal funding in South Carolina, as we said before, we're kind of in the average. And then with state funding, we're notoriously small. But like, we saw that with the federal funding, the average of the bottom 10 was much, much larger than the average of the top 10. And so we're saying that we need to get to a position where maybe we're getting less from the federal government. But we can't immediately get there. So our recommendation in this area is to move towards a model of getting less funding from the federal government and relying significantly on state funding, and using the federal funding that we get today, and that we get right now, and start to use that in such a way that it would push us towards to spending more wisely. So with the money that we have today, we should use more wisely, so that down the road we can continue to use our money wisely, and we're in a better position where we're getting more from the state because we're increasing revenues for the state, and we're getting less from the federal government because we, in that sense, we have some autonomy.
How does this help increase revenues I mean, how does this help the state being more productive?
Well,
So,
yeah.
yeah, so one of the conclusions we kind of came to was, so the reason, if you want to go back to the slide about federal funding, so, as you can see, the top 10 receive significantly less than the bottom 10 on average. We think because the government has recognized that these states that these states are better off, they give them less. So that's why we think with our general tax fund and tax reform, and then our so with our tax reform and then using the money from the budget surplus year after year on state road maintenance, things like that, this will then begin to kind of push South Carolina to the top of that ranking. Then will in turn allow us to kind of be in the average of the top 10 and receive less state funding. Because I think I know for most government programs, the more money you get, kind of the more you can do, but obviously, money doesn't always equal efficiency here, as we can
Sure.
see.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's why I think, well, Michael said, move towards that model, is we do what we can here in the state, maybe up our funding here for the next 15, 20 years, however long it takes, to kind of get us to where we are receiving numbers similar to this.
Is there a better, higher, or lesser use of roads, and is that in your findings? So for example, we said Myrtle Beach, it's great.
Right.
I want roads to be good in Myrtle Beach, because I want tourists to come from Ohio and go to Myrtle Beach, right, and spend all their money here.
Exactly.
But I also want it in Charleston. Now, I would imagine that in the backwoods somewhere, it's not nearly as important as it is in the major city.
Right.
Are there any inequalities in the roads?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, if you're comparing the back roads to Charleston roads or Myrtle Beach roads, there's not, you can't, it's kind of hard to compare those two.
Okay.
Because there's not as much traffic, so there's not gonna be as much, you know, repair needed. Now, I'm not saying that there's not any repair in the back roads that need to be done,
Okay.
but I would, you know, in a prioritized list, no, it, not as important.
Mhm.
But I'm not saying, you know, Farmer John out there doesn't want his road fixed.
I'm sure he does.
So, yes, that could be something that they can fix, but I really don't see roads, you know, back roads off of 95 or 26 going to the upstate.
Mhm.
I don't see them being that big of a project.
Yeah, and again, the biggest problem that we saw was that in terms of funding, the funding was going more directly to projects that were above $100 million
Mhm.
from the STIB. And then in terms of the SCDOT, they pick the projects that they choose, and so they can fund what they want. And often this ends up being funding new projects like what the Ravenel Bridge had been,
Yeah.
funding new projects like 526.
So, but the
which-
Ravenel Bridge was a big bang for the buck.
Yeah,
I
no,
mean,
it was great.
And we have to figure out what are the big bang for the buck kind of
Yeah,
projects.
exactly. But then for every Ravenel Bridge, there's a 526, which
Mhm.
is still under construction.
Languishing,
Has
yeah.
still not been fully completed, and they keep shelling out money for it in such a way that like constituents are worried that we may run out of money from the STIB and from the SCDOT because it's being put on these big projects that are either new construction or new roads, and there's less of a focus on fixing up the older roads.
This is a tough question because all roads are different. There's
Yeah,
2 lanes,
exactly.
there's 4 lanes, 8 lane, whatever. Do we have any sense of how far on an average highway $100 million will get us? I mean, is that 10 miles? Is
So
that
it's really
100 miles?
odd. So we looked at this in the very beginning. So, you know, there's a bridge connecting IOP to, I guess, Charleston or whatever.
Yeah.
That bridge cost us like $40 million, but then the clearing from I-26 all the way like from here to Columbia cost us like half that.
Well, yeah, but that's for Isle of Palms, and it was apparently plated in gold before they paved it.
Yeah, so it's just, and you know, that's like a half.
Yeah,
it's
so
like a half
that's the
mile.
question.
Yeah.
So you know, what will $100 million buy us? I
Right.
guess is the question.
Well, and that's the thing is it just depends. It depends on the
What you're
district
trying
you're
to do.
in. Because that was,
We were gonna
we
measure
were
that.
going to measure that across like the top 10 and bottom 10 states and in our state and then compare it. And one of the problems that we realized was
Yeah, there's not
there's
apples or oranges.
so many factors that go
Right.
into the funding. There's the construction companies that are around you. There are the price of the materials that you have. It's not just we're gonna put a road down and per square foot or per mile of road,
Yeah.
it's gonna cost this much money because it's just different across the board. And so with that being said, one of the things that we realized was, yeah, it looks like the average top 10 is better, and we can say that they probably are better off because they're getting less money from the federal government. But across the board, because some states are bigger than other states, some states are smaller, the size of the funding that they get from the federal government, we can't conclusively say because they get less funding from the federal government,
Yeah.
they're gonna be better off. Because
Yeah,
just like
this is
here with
correlation, not
roads.
causation, right?
yeah, just like here, because there's so many factors that go into constructing roads, it's the same thing with here. So what we ultimately came to is that because size of funding is not directly correlated to efficiency, we think that the problem is not necessarily how much we're spending, but rather how we're spending it
Right.
and who is spending it. And with that being said, I'm gonna turn things back over.
Don't
to
run
Hunter.
away before you, let me answer a question. Think to our last chapter,
Yes.
how things or projects are funded, how contracts are made. Did you get into anything, I mean, is it cost plus or is it competitive bidding
It's
or?
competitive, a lot of it's competitive bidding.
So competitive bidding then would lend itself toward getting the lowest possible cost bidder.
Mhm.
Now, my experience on Dorchester Road was that was repaved a half dozen times in about 6 months.
Yeah.
Because it just kept getting torn up. Do we know anything about the
So-
efficiency or effectiveness?
What I think the issue is since the state wants to spend less, you've got all these companies like, hey, I'll go lower, I'll go lower, I'll go
Right.
lower. And then they're like, oh, hey, well, this company said they'll do it like, we expected it to be this, so it's gonna be way down here. Like, sure, of course, we'll throw these guys this money. And then they do it, and it's kind of shoddy work, and then they're like, wow, this has to be redone. So they
So-
kind of set up another bidding
So if
system.
it is shoddy work, I mean, is it guaranteed? Does the private company have to make up for that?
So we couldn't really find any metric on that. We were looking for like repavements and things like that, but a lot of these companies, they're just like, they'll be used, some of them we use multiple times, some of them we use one and done. So it's really just kind of random. That's like, you know, like we saw in the 4th Congressional District, Senator Hugh Leatherman and Mr. Wooten, they actually see a lot of their companies, Senator Hugh Leatherman's concrete company and Mr. Wooten's engineering firm or company, they see a lot of those contracts that come from the state.
Yeah.
So those two being in the state, involved in the SCDOT, involved in the commission, involved in JTRC, those two see a lot of contracts from the state, and it's really odd. If there's a bidding system, it's hard to believe that they are always,
Well, they're in a know of what a legitimate bid would be to get that job, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I mean, so this is a double-edged sword, because if they're in the business, they know how to do it. So
Yeah.
that's kind of good to have the knowledge, but it also creates a conflict of interest potentially. So maybe there should be a wall there between,
Yeah.
you know, you can either serve or you can get the jobs, but you can't do both, I don't know.
Well, and the way that it's set up too, as I think about it, is awfully similar to what we talked about at the beginning of the semester with how the Hoover Dam was constructed,
Mhm.
that we saw in the America, the Story of Us videos that you guys watch. One of the things in there was they ended up going with a guy who said he could get the Hoover Dam done in half as much time
Yeah.
as everyone else. And what we know today is, A, the concrete is still cooling. It hasn't fully cooled down. And two, the way that it was constructed, it only provided enough power for the city right there and was kind of a bust outside of that. Like, it didn't really
Mhm.
do anything as big as they said they would do, other than maybe create jobs for that 5-year period of time.
Okay.
So it's a little similar. But now Hunter's gonna pick up the thread that he was already talking about.
Yeah, so kind of, we already touched on a little bit of structural reform. This is kind of like almost a complete overhaul of the SCDOT Commission and the JTRC. So we'll start with the Commission. Actually, you know, better yet, we're going to start with how to get on the Commission. We're going to start with the JTRC, and we're going to say completely abolish. Because I think there is this breeding ground for corruption, or we have come to the conclusion that there's a breeding ground for corruption there. Not that they are corrupt.
Is it lucrative to be on the JTRC?
I think if you get to choose, I think if you get to screen the candidates and say, hey, you're the only one that's qualified, you're the only one that's agreed to really, to kind of scratch my
Yeah,
back.
so you're talking about the second step, I'm talking about the actual dollar figure, if there is any dollar amount associated with serving in that capacity. It's probably low.
Yeah.
But-
I think the lucrative part would be able to control who gets to
Sure.
be in your district, or your legislative.
How about the commission itself?
So the commission itself, they pretty much get to choose who gets what projects.
Okay.
So that's why, so if you completely abolish this and kind of get rid of all the standards, saying, hey, you know, because the issue we ran into was with the requirements to be on the commission, is that very last line that says management. I mean, that could literally be anything. That could be a sociology professor who has never done anything in any form of construction, law, anything like that. and they say, hey, I managed students for 5 years, I was a teacher, I managed a lot of grades, yada, yada, yada. And it's somebody that would maybe help a senator or a congressman out and say, hey, sure, you know what, guys, let's put this guy in, he's gonna help me out, I'll help you guys get in other guys that are favorable to you in your district. So that's really the hard part on this, is that last part, management. Why even have?
Well, no, there could very well be bringing some business sense to the table. It's just, in a worst case scenario, it could be
Yeah, be
what you
whoever you
described.
wanted.
I don't see the same boogeyman that you do there, but keep going.
Okay. So then that kind of leads us to the commission reform. So we want the commissioner itself, so the commissioner of the DOT commission, as well as the DOT secretary, because the DOT secretary, like we said, is kind of a figurehead. The commissioner is kind of the one who gets everything done, is appointed by the governor and kind of reports directly to the governor and acts on her behalf. So he or she is elected by the people. We kind of believe that if that person is acting on her behalf, his or her behalf, they will kind of be acting in the people's behalf because he or she is going to
accountable, sure.
Yeah. So, however, we think the commission itself should be changed. The landscape of the commission should be changed. We think it should be democratically elected by the legislative districts. And we were kind of tossing around ideas for term limits, and we think they're elected when the governor is elected and stay in for the 8 years of the governor, so that makes sense. They would appoint an 8-year commissioner by the governor, and then when the governorship is up, that person's term is up as well. So, or not necessarily, because it could be 4 years. However, we think 8 years is a good, gives them just enough time to be effective and not have to worry about running for re-election. So it's not like some of our state legislators where they get a 2-year term and it's like, oh, hey, wow, I just got out of session, but I've got to campaign this entire next year.
So you're gonna run into rational ignorance with that. That's what your trade-off is.
Yeah.
Your trade-off is you know these clubby insiders for rational ignorance of the people. For the sanitary water and soil commission, I voted for Dr. Pearson because I had no idea who the guy was.
The guy from high school won.
Right.
From my high school.
Yeah, I have no idea who the guy is, so it was a throwaway vote. So that's what you're gonna run into,
Yeah.
right? Is the rational ignorance of each district better than the clubbiness?
Well, so I think with how big, so we thought about that, we think how big of an issue the roads are in South Carolina and how big of an issue the SCDOT is. I think this is something that the people would be rationally ignorant about. The reason that,
Why not have an appointed board from the governor?
Also, we think there is a certain level of checks and balances that you kind of lose there. So, granted, we're all fallen people. We all kind of we don't all have agendas, but we all kind of maybe want to side with the people. Hey, I'm from here. Maybe I should help them out. It looks like they're doing bad. I think when you have a commission completely appointed by a governor, you can then kind of run into.
What if it's appointed by the governor, one per district?
I still think that would be okay with my.
Yeah, it's the same thing. If the governor is appointing them, then we think that the governor would not have as much accountability as they might have if part of the commission is selected by the people themselves.
I agree, but you have to weigh that against rational ignorance.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
but, and one of the things that we saw though is that, public choice itself says you cannot, with factions that rise up, with people that are going to flood, you can't get rid of them. I was telling Adam the other day, because he had the same question, and we were able to think in that way. In Scripture, the Apostle Paul tells us, factions are going to happen, and you can't, they're good, ultimately, because they push people to truth. And while, obviously, South Carolina is not a church, the factions that we have in South Carolina, we can't get rid of them, and we can't abolish them, because that would be more dictator-like and more enforcing of a society than otherwise. But they're going to exist, but the existence of one faction should and will create the existence of another faction that will oppose them, and ultimately that's where we get competition, that's where we get fires and
That's
stuff.
a point I was going to bring up. So say 1st Congressional District, Charleston, I-526, as Michael brought up, there are a lot of people who want to see that done, completed. There are a lot of people who say, hey, let's scrap it, let's pick up all the toys we got on the side of the road and let's be done with it. I think when those people see, hey, this guy's running for the commission and his goal is to finish I-526, and the other side sees that and they're gonna be like, whoa, 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 we got to find a guy who's against that. We've got to run him. We've got to, or we've got to vote against this person because the other person running is against, me. So I think, to Michael's point, there's actual a real situation that could come from that. The last, but certainly not least, we are going to push for more transparency in the Office of Chief Internal Auditor.
Okay.
So Adam and I were, mostly Adam, he was looking up a lot of this. We found a lot of the names on the Chief Internal Auditor website, but you would pull up their page, try to see who they were, what they did, and there was no information about them at all. We Googled them, there was no information about them on like SC.gov or anything like that. So they're obviously state employees, so we're hoping there would be something somewhere, a little bit about them. But basically they kind of do, I would imagine, a more advanced and moving job of what we just did. However, they also will investigate things like fraud in the SCDOT. So in a funny kind of odd little thing here, when we talk about the breeding ground for corruption here, Commissioner Mike Wooten, there was a chief internal auditor who was wanting to investigate fraud and corruption in the SCDOT. Well, Commissioner Wooten, he actually found a way, I guess, to use some legislative and governmental tricks and actually blocked one of the auditors from the Office of the Chief Internal Auditor for investigating the SCDOT on fraud and corruption within it. So I thought that's one reason why, if we had a little more transparency, because I didn't actually know this had happened until we were doing this project. I think that's a pretty big deal in the state, if our DOT is blocking corruption and fraud investigations, that's a little weird for me. So I think with that transparency, finding out who these people are, holding them accountable, bringing those things to light, I think that will lead to an overall, that kind of build up from the ground floor. So once we start with this structure, I think kind of the rest will fall into place, the funding, the allocation, the spending, and things like that. So last but not least, we will bring it back over to Michael for our final conclusion.
Yeah, so in conclusion, and as all of us have already said, and as I've said before, we're not trying to completely decimate the landscape that we already have politically, or just remove anything that we already have. The idea is we want to take a staggered approach to getting somewhere where we do have more accountability. So like as we said with the STIDs, with funding. And just in that sense, we want a scenario where the governor is held accountable to the people, the SCDOT is held accountable to both the governor and the people. The STID, we wouldn't have the JTRC anymore because we're proposing just abolishing them completely, for good reason, I believe. But ultimately, we're calling for better accountability, better checks and balances, which should lead to greater efficiency, because when you're being accountable to your constituents, when you're acting in the best interest of your constituents, and when your constituents are holding you in check for what you're doing, you're going to be more efficient towards what's best for most people. And we felt like that was the best idea. Additionally, we called for structural reform significantly in the SCDOT itself. Hunter brought it up. Before we started the project, there were some lawsuits that hit the floor, and there were some corruption charges that were brought against the SCDOT. And after we started the project, I believe there were 2 more that came up, and we got that from Post-and-Courier, which is pretty good source of news. But like, just the mere existence of that shows us that something's wrong, that we may not be definitely really bad, because after all we are ranked 35 out of 50. We're definitely not really bad, but because we're also ranked 35, we could be a whole lot better. And we think that by following better structural reform, because there is a problem, by reforming the structure that we do have right now, that would be better. And one of the things too, I don't know if you're about to say it or not, but I think it was it back in 2006, we did have a structure, and then it was replaced. Like they reformed it to what we have today. And then.
Why?
Why?
The legislation expired.
Yeah.
That's the only reason.
Yeah, so remember when I talked about how
So-
the governor, there was a gubernatorial appointment of the DOT secretary?
Yeah.
Well, in 2015, that ran out, so now the secretary, when she.
So it's not because we replaced it with a better structure, it's just
No.
because it's sunset.
Yeah,
Right.
essentially.
Well,
So going back to whatever that previous structure, do we know that it ran better under the previous structure, or?
No, a lot of that data was really, so they were like in a lot of these like really small files, and then when I say small files, you download it and it ends up being like 580 pages of like numbers spent over,
Yeah,
like
gotcha.
a biennial
Okay.
year.
Yeah.
It'd be worth looking into.
Yeah, and so some of that structural reform Michael was talking about, that we haven't really changed the landscape of how they choose those. We're not taking any power away from the commission,
Yeah.
because we want to give them a certain level of autonomy, because we don't want it very bureaucratic on how they choose a lot of these products or projects. That's why we think, though, if they're democratically elected by the people, they will actually choose projects that are within the people's best interest.
Well, I would, you said you don't want it bureaucratic, I think you actually might want it more bureaucratic. What I mean by that is, where was Virginia in that list? They were in the top 10.
Yeah.
What, do you know what number they were?
You want to scroll back up?
You don't have to scroll back, up, just
I
ballpark,
think maybe it
5,
was 7 or 8.
9? So I had a student, back when I was teaching back in Virginia, who worked for VDOT, okay? And they were really bound and beholden by certain laws or rules that if a project meets this level of whatever, we must address this. And so they had a triaging system that I don't see that we have here.
No,
We may have
don't.
it, but I don't see that we have it. And that might take part of the angst out, because things have to get done in a particular order
Right.
by rule.
Exactly. And that's one of those things where with Act 114, we think that maybe Act 114.1 should probably be revised and be made more concrete. But on top of that, it should be made binding on the SCDOT, which right now it's not.
Okay.
And that's one of those structural areas wherein they can pick and choose. They don't have to follow any criteria other than their own.
Okay.
The criteria that they follow is their own in that sense. And with that all together, we think we need to be spending wisely. I think that goes without saying. If you have $100 and you spend 110 of it, that doesn't balance correctly. There's no way that you're actually even spending well if you're spending money that you don't have. You're spending money that you might be getting down the road, but you don't have it immediately. We think that just across the board it's unethical, it's immoral, and it's wrong for us to spend money unwisely and to count chickens that haven't hatched yet. We need to exist in the here and now while keeping a firm idea, a firm glimpse of the future that we can move towards, but we need to do what's reasonable and correct here and now, with an idea of the past and what has not worked in the past and what could work. So ultimately, that's what we've researched.
Yeah, and with that, we want to thank the teammates that aren't up here presenting. I don't know if the camera is seeing, but there's 7 other people out there that definitely helped over the course of this semester.
Yeah, none of us could have done it without them. So
That's them.
yeah, thank you so much for your time. It is a great pleasure and honor to